we are very fortunate today that this year in Minneapolis, the Democracy Convention has been taking place at the University of Minnesota. David Swanson of World Beyond War is the convener of that group, and he has consented to be our keynote speaker today. David is a peace activist nationally, and we are very pleased to welcome you to the Minneapolis Lindale Park Peace Garden on this August 6th of 2017.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Louder? Is that better? Thank you for inviting me to speak here. I'm grateful, I'm honored, there we go. But it's not an easy task. I've spoken on television, I've spoken to large crowds and important big shots, but here you are asking me to speak to hundreds of thousands of ghosts and billions of ghosts in waiting. To think about this subject wisely, we must keep all of them in mind, as well as those who tried to prevent Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and those who survived, and those who reported, and those who forced themselves to remember over and over in order to educate others. Perhaps even more difficult is thinking about those who rushed to make all those deaths and injuries happen, or who went along unquestioning, and those who do the same today. Nice people, decent people, people superficially similar to you and me, people who do not abuse their children or their pets, people perhaps like the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet who was asked last week if he would launch a nuclear attack on China if President Trump ordered him to. His response was a very principled and reasonable yes. He would obey orders. If people don't obey orders, the world falls apart. Therefore, one must obey orders, even when they rip the world apart. Even illegal orders. Orders that violate the UN Charter. Orders that ignore the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Orders that annihilate forever all existence of or memory of every beautiful childhood memory and every child. In contrast, Jeremy Corbyn, the head of the Labour Party in the UK and the next Prime Minister, if current trends continue, has said he would never use nuclear weapons, and he has been widely denounced for being so unreasonable. We can and must eliminate nuclear weapons from the face of the earth before they are intentionally or accidentally used. Some of them are thousands of times what was dropped on Hiroshima. A small number of them would create a nuclear winter that starves us out of existence. Their proliferation and normalization guarantees that our luck will run out if we do not eliminate them. Nukes have been accidentally launched in Arkansas and dropped on North Carolina. Comedian John Oliver said not to worry, that's why we have 2 Carolinas. The list of near misses and misunderstandings is staggering. Steps like the new treaty advanced by most of the world's nations to ban possession of nuclear weapons must be worked for with everything we've got, and followed with campaigns to divest all funding and to extend the process to include nuclear energy and depleted uranium weapons. But bringing the nuclear nations, and in particular the one we are standing in, to join the world on this will be a major hurdle. And it may be insurmountable unless we take steps not only against this worst of all weapons, thus far manufactured, but also against the institution of war itself. Mikhail Gorbachev says that unless the United States scales back its aggression and military dominance with non-nuclear weapons, non-nuclear nations, other nations will not abandon the nuclear missiles that they believe protect them from attack. there's a reason that many observers view the latest sanctions on Russia, North Korea, and Iran as a prelude to war on Iran, rather than on the other two. It is the ideology of war, as well as the armaments and agencies of war, that condemns Jeremy Corbyn while applauding a man who professes blind allegiance and obedience to an illegal order. One wonders whether such good soldiers and sailors view Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov as a degenerate or as a hero. He was, of course, a Soviet naval officer who refused to launch nuclear weapons during the Cuban Missile Crisis, thereby quite possibly saving the world. As enjoyable as we may find all the lies and exaggeration and demonization directed at Russia by our elected and unelected officials and their media outlets, I think erecting statues of Vasily Arkhipov in U.S. parks would be much more useful, perhaps next to statues of Frank Kellogg. It's not simply the ideology of war we have to overcome, but parochialism, nationalism, racism, sexism, materialism, and the belief in our prerogative to destroy the planet, whether by radiation or by fossil fuel consumption. This is why I have misgivings about things like a march for science. I have yet to hear about a march for wisdom being planned, or a rally for humility, or a demonstration for kindness. We even had a rally for nothing, opposed to rallies organized by a comedian in Washington, D.C., prior to ever having had one demonstration for these other important causes. There's a line in a book and a movie by Carl Sagan called Contact that has the main character sagely wanting to inquire of a more technologically advanced civilization how they made it past the stage of, quote, technological adolescence without destroying themselves. This is not technological adolescence that we are in. Technology will continue to produce yet more and more dangerous devices as time goes by. Technology will not become mature and begin producing only helpful stuff, because technology is not a human being. This is moral adolescence we are in. We empower delinquents who urge police to crack heads and their buddies to assault women, and who try to solve problems with giant walls, junior high level propaganda, denial of health care, and the frequent firing of people. Or we empower equally adolescent prom king characters like the US president who went to Hiroshima a little over a year ago and declared, quite falsely, that, quote, artifacts tell us that violent conflict appeared with the very first man, end quote, and who urged us to resign ourselves to permanent war with the words, we may not be able to eliminate man's capacity to do evil, so nations and the alliances that we form must possess the means to defend ourselves, end quote. Yet a dominant militarized nation gains absolutely nothing defensive from nuclear weapons. They do not deter terrorist attacks by non-state actors in any way. They do not add an iota to the U.S. military's ability to deter nations from attacking, given the U.S. ability to destroy anything, anywhere, at any time with non-nuclear weapons. They also don't win wars, and the U.S., the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France, and China have all lost wars against non-nuclear powers while possessing nuclear weapons. Nor, in the event of a global nuclear war, can any outrageous quantity of weaponry protect the United States in any way from apocalypse. We must work to eliminate nuclear weapons, President Barack Obama said in Prague and in Hiroshima. But he said probably not in his lifetime. We have no choice but to prove him wrong about that timing. We need to evolve beyond what our leaders tell us about nuclear weapons, including what our schools tell our children about the justification for bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'm skipping over some paragraphs of evidence for what I just said in the name of saving time. The United States needs to stop lying to itself and start leading a reverse arms race. This will require humility, deep honesty, and openness to international inspections. But as Tad Daly has written, quote, "Yes, international inspections here would intrude upon our sovereignty, but detonations of atom bombs here would also intrude upon our sovereignty. The only question is, which of those two intrusions do we find less excruciating?" Thank you.
Our last but not least speaker is Ben Manski. Ben is an American sociologist, lawyer, and democracy advocate. He is the founder of the Liberty Tree Foundation for the Democratic Revolution and co-founder of Move to Amend, Wisconsin Wave, and the 180-degree Movement for Democracy and Education and United for Peace and Justice. In 2011, he served as chair as the first biennial Democracy Convention, and I am so pleased to see him again after all these years. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. And I have to say, World Beyond War and your partners have put together an excellent Peace and Democracy conference here at the Democracy Convention, and I'm honored to have been asked to join this panel. The work that you have presented and that you have sort of clarified for a popular audience, and that I look forward to reading more about, and the work that you have done, David, to bring this history forward to those audiences and to put the call out and to help people get together and do the organizing around us, I think are really critical. I'm here to talk about two additional cases that are cases from history, one of them recent history, the other too distant, that represent other approaches to dealing with essentially the same fundamental problem, which is how do we prevent war from taking place. Some of what I'm going to say will be very familiar to you, some of it will maybe be familiar to some of you, and some of it I expect will be quite new to most of you. I'll start with a familiar, and that is to quote from from John Quincy Adams, who I mistakenly actually thought this was a quote from Washington. I think Adams was paraphrasing Washington when he said, "America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy." And I think Washington had a similar statement about beasts to slay. There are many things that were terrible about the years that followed the great years of the American Revolution, the years between 1776 and 1791. Those were the good years, but there were many things that were terrible about the years that followed. But there were also some things that, in our critique of American history and the way it's been presented, many, I think, on the left have forgotten. And one of those is that there is an originalism that is true, and that has been forgotten not only by the majority of the American people, but certainly by the federal courts. And that is an originalism that understands that the founding fathers were concerned about the prospects of the United States becoming a particular kind of empire. There was a type of empire they wanted the United States to be, an empire from coast to coast, an empire that would sweep savagery, a white supremacist empire, right, here in the continent of North America. But they were also concerned that the United States not become the kind of empire that they had just rebelled against, in an empire that spanned the globe. And that concern is actually very clearly laid out in the Constitution of the United States in providing that only Congress has the power to declare war, right? And that, I think, is what is commonly known. And it's commonly known in part because most of the people in this room either came of age politically in the years following Vietnam or were around for the days of the War Powers Resolution, 1973, and the reaction to the Vietnam War, in which it was recognized that the United States had entered a new period in our history in that we had been through the Korean War and the Vietnam War and a whole series of smaller wars that were called other things, right? And that Congress had not voted to declare war in any of those instances. And so there was a reaction to that, and there was a movement to try to prevent Congress from sort of abdicating its war declaring responsibilities that produced the War Powers Resolution. It's really a War Powers Act, right? It's actually has the force of law that states that the President has to go to Congress for authorization should military hostilities be commenced. I believe it's within 60 days, is that correct? I'm looking for, I believe it's a 60-day period, yeah. So that was sort of an attempt to fix a fundamental problem, which was that was recognized in the years following at the end of the Vietnam War, at least in terms of our involvement in the Vietnam War, which was that we had a constitution which was intended to ensure that the war declaring powers, the war initiating powers, resided with Congress, with a legislative branch that was sort of more accountable to the people, supposedly, and to the legislatures originally, and not with the executive, because there was a fear of kingly powers being held by the president, that the president would become a king, and that the United States would become an imperial power that of the type that we had rebelled against, Great Britain, right? So there's some pushback there. That has had very limited effect, unfortunately. And the effects of the War Powers Act were sort of present, especially in the decade following. But if you look at our recent experience, we have seen that Republican or Democrat in the White House, there are certain processes that are larger than single men or individuals, depending on who occupies the Oval Office. And so under Obama, we actually had, to my knowledge, for the first time, a president who chose not to abide by the provisions of the War Powers Act in Libya, did not seek congressional authorization. Other major military actions conducted by the United States that have been prolonged, that have gone on for longer periods of time, have been authorized by acts of Congress. They're called authorizations for the use of military force, or AUMF, but that action was not, and to my knowledge, neither has the Syria campaign and other campaigns since. So that's where we stand right now. That we have this fundamental problem that has been recognized by large sections of the population, that Congress is supposed to have the power to declare war, but Congress doesn't actually exercise that power. Now that recognition could be addressed in a couple different ways. Right? It could be addressed statutorily, as was done in the 1970s in this country. It can be addressed in the streets. It can be addressed through an appeal to international law and bringing international law to localities and to the states and to non-party states and to broader populations, and it should be. It could also be addressed by recognizing that perhaps Congress cannot be trusted to exercise that war declaring power. And that recognition led to a 20-year campaign at the beginning of the 20th century, in the years especially following World War I and leading into, unfortunately, World War II, to take the power to declare war from Congress and give it to the people. And that amendment, the War Referendum Amendment, which became known as the Ludlow Amendment, Ludlow, sponsored at various points by other members of Congress, but he represented the state of Indiana. Below of Wausau, Wisconsin was a lead sponsor in the House. I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly. This was a multi-partisan initiative that came out of the peace movement of the day to make clear that unless the United States was militarily invaded, the power to declare war resided with the people of the United States, and it sets out terms for a national vote on declaring war. Right? The Ludlow Amendment actually came very close to winning majority support in the House of Representatives. It looked like it was going to pass in 1937, it was only a last-minute series of interventions from members of the Roosevelt administration to arm twist House Democrats that led to Ludlow not actually making it to a full vote, which it would have won. So that was a push, the Ludlow Amendment. In the 1970s, there were some who remembered that history or relearned it. Congressman Ron Dellums, who some of you will know of, was lead sponsor of the People Power Over War Amendment, which is modeled after the Ludlow Amendment. And this is one approach that it had there was less of a mass movement behind this that was organized. I mean, the campaigning for Ludlow was just incredible in the 1930s. But it did have multiple co-sponsors in Congress and was attempted again. I've written about this history. I didn't actually have time to go back and reread my article about it, but it appeared in a book, ComeHomeAmerica.us, which, do you have a chapter in there? Probably.
I think so.
Yeah, you can find it. If you go to my website, which I'll put up here, benmanski.com, you can find a link to my publications, which are on academia, and I've decided to include some of my, a lot of the work that I've done that's not actually academic work. I am in a PhD program, I have a law degree, but some of this research that I did on the Ludlow Amendment was sort of for fun, right? Like, what can we do to help the peace movement in this day and age develop to bring back a new tool? And so I did that research, and the title of that chapter and then an article that was based on it is The Struggle to Put Ballots Before Bullets. Right? So you can find that up there. How much time do I have here?
You have 5 minutes.
Okay, so the more important part I have less time for, so I'll try to bring this forward. So I would advocate that we take up the War Referendum Amendment again, for all kinds of reasons we can get into the discussion, but it's probably obvious to you. The other effort that was made from the very beginning and to prevent the United States from becoming sort of a global imperial power and from becoming, frankly, a problem for the people of this country and of other nations, was to constitutionalize war powers in practice and not just in text, right? To recognize that constitutions matter when they're actually felt in the distribution of material power in society. So I'm using sociological terms, Marxist terms even in that case, but basically what I'm talking about is the Constitution of the Armed Forces of the United States from the get-go was designed to prevent the executive branch from engaging in sort of rampant imperialism. The United States, and I don't have time to get into the whole history of law, and Leah Bolger knows this well, so I'm not going to even get into the history of, to the text of the Constitution and so on, but I'll summarize it this way, and I feel fully confident to defend what I'm about to say in simple terms if we need to get into details. We did not have armed forces that were capable of force projection in the United States until World War I. Okay. In 1898, in the days leading up to the U.S. invasion of various Spanish colonial possessions, Cuba, Guam, et cetera, the Army of the United States had 10,000 men under arms, and there were over 200,000 members of the regular trained militia in the United States, or National Guard as they were then known. Okay? So for most of the history of this country, we did not have, we didn't not only have an Air Force or a Pentagon, but we didn't even have an army that was capable of invading and occupying another country. And so, and this was by design, right? There are several clauses in the Constitution that are called the militia clauses. It's not just the Second Amendment, right? There are several other clauses in the Constitution that deal with the militia, right? And the armed forces of the United States were primarily composed of a well-regulated militia operating through the states and regulated by Congress that were intended to provide for national defense, but were understood to prove a bane of empire, as Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts. He was much maligned because he's the source of the term gerrymander, right? But he was also an anti-imperialist, and he called the militia the bane of empire, basically by having a popular army, popular military, I should say, that was made up of the people themselves who would not be willingly sent over to the Philippines, for example, as militia units were, and to kill and hunt other people who were like us, right? And I'm sort of paraphrasing from some of the accounts of militia members who were inducted into the army for that invasion and occupation. We would be in a position to prevent the executive branch from engaging in empire building of the kind that we have in the 20th century, right? So there's a whole history of the militia system, which is very important and interesting. I can give you many examples of the ways in which the militia system functioned to provide a restraint on Empire Building in the War of 1812. Abraham Lincoln, for example, his first elected commission was as captain of a unit of the Illinois militia. His unit actually refused to go back to fight in what is now Wisconsin in the Black Hawk Wars for, again, some of these same reasons. You know, Lincoln said we could see that these were men like ourselves who were farmers, right? There were many sort of examples in which the militia actually refused to participate in actions that were counter to their interests, right? But essentially what you need to know is that the 20th century is in part a history of the federalization of the militia system. The transformation of a system which primarily had been decentralized and intended to be the bane of empire into an auxiliary of the United States Armed Forces, to the point at which today the bulk of U.S. occupying forces actually come out of the National Guard or out of private military contractors and are not regular U.S. Army. Right? This is a fairly recent development. Okay? So that's a bit of that's a very quickly summed up history there of the National Guard, of the purpose behind the militia system and the National Guard, and so on. What you should know is that for 3 years there was a very active campaign in 20 states in the United States to, quote, bring the Guard home, it's the law. And that's where some of us in this room came together. We got legislation introduced in 13 of those states to require that governors review federalization orders calling the Guard into national service prior to releasing them into service to ensure that that order was lawful. Right? So the legal strategy here was pretty sophisticated. It's not my own, it's that of Benson Scotch of Vermont. But we got pretty far. We got majority support in 2 chambers, and then Barack Obama was elected and we lost most of our Democratic sponsors, unfortunately, is what happened with that campaign. This may be a time to bring back the Bring the Guard Home, It's the Law campaign, and I look forward to talking with you about other strategies we can pursue here. So, thank you. Really a major force in that effort.
So we got to support people's media, right? We got to support people's media. I do want to point this out, folks. This movement and tonight's event was not covered by corporate media at all, right? But I do want to give a big shout out to any of you who are watching me right now. Let's just acknowledge you're watching it on people's media. Wherever it is that you're watching me right now, some unpaid volunteer took the time to record it. Thank you. Some unpaid volunteer took the time to upload this to create the infrastructure for you to watch it. So we got to support people's media, right? We got to support people's media.